Alara Thompson stood outside her wooden cabin, her hand resting on her round belly, feeling the gentle movement of the baby inside. She took a deep breath, letting the crisp morning air of the Rocky Mountains fill her lungs. Fresh snow had fallen the night before, covering the ground in a soft, glistening blanket under the pale morning light. Today was one of those days when she felt particularly lonely. Caleb, her husband, was still working at a research station hundreds of miles away. He could only communicate via radio, and though she always told him she was fine, the truth was, she missed him terribly. She walked slowly along the narrow trail behind her house, carefully placing her steps on the pristine snow. This was part of her daily routine, walking and tracking animal signs, a habit she had developed since her early years studying animal behavior. But today, something made her stop. On the bark of an old fir tree ahead, deep and ominous claw marks marred the surface. Alara stepped closer, running her fingers over the rough, scarred wood. These were not marks left by the wind or weather but by the claws of a large animal, most likely a grizzly bear. She shivered. Grizzlies were not uncommon in this region, but they usually avoided humans. However, if a bear had marked a tree so close by, it meant either its territory was being threatened or it sensed something unusual. She glanced around, feeling an inexplicable sense of being watched. A cold gust of wind swept through the trees, carrying with it the eerie whisper of the forest. The air felt heavier. Alara took a step back, intending to return home, but at that moment, a soft noise caught her attention. Ahead, emerging from the dense shadows of the trees, was a massive figure. She held her breath. A grizzly bear, thick fur dusted with snow, stood on the trail, no more than 30 yards away. Her heart pounded. She knew she had to stay calm. Don't run. Don't show fear. But what stunned her wasn't the bear's sheer size. It was the way it moved. It didn't growl or charge at her. Instead, it lifted one front paw, extended it forward, then placed it down. Then, it repeated the motion with the other, a rhythmic movement, almost as if it was signing. A chill ran down Alara's spine. She was no stranger to animal behavior, but this was something beyond the ordinary. The bear was neither aggressive nor wary. It seemed to be trying to communicate. A strong gust of wind howled past, making her shiver, and then, another sound, sharp, cracking, and terrifying, echoed from the mountainside behind her. She spun around. High on the ridge above, an enormous sheet of snow had begun to break loose. An avalanche, the nightmare of anyone living in the mountains. The bear let out a deep, rumbling sound before suddenly charging forward, not toward her, but toward the valley below, then turned its head, its dark eyes gleaming under the dim light. It was signaling her, a warning. Alara didn't hesitate. Instinct took over. She ran, following the bear. She plunged down the slope, her feet sinking into the thick snow. Behind her, the cracking noise grew deafening. A glance over her shoulder made her stomach drop. An immense wall of white was roaring down the mountainside, consuming everything in its path. The bear ran ahead, his powerful strides carving a path through the snow. Alara forced herself to keep up, her breath coming in sharp gasps, each exhale forming clouds in the freezing air. Her hand clutched her belly, shielding the tiny life inside her. Near the base of the slope, the bear suddenly veered left, disappearing into a hollow between two rocky outcroppings. There was no time to think. Alara dove in after it, tumbling onto the thick snow and curling into a protective ball, hands shielding her head. At that exact moment, the avalanche thundered past above them, a monstrous wave of ice and debris swallowing the trail where she had stood mere seconds ago. Time seemed to stop. Only the distant hiss of settling snow and her own ragged breathing filled the silence. It took her a long moment before she dared to lift her head. Snow still drifted lightly from above, but the deadly wave had come to a halt. In front of her, the grizzly stood motionless, watching her with an unfathomable gaze. Alara slowly got to her feet, her legs trembling. She didn't know what to say. She couldn't believe she had just been saved by a bear. But as she placed a hand over her belly, feeling the baby's reassuring movements, she knew one thing: this was more than just luck. The bear lingered a moment longer, then turned away and silently disappeared into the forest. It vanished into the snow-covered trees as if it had never been there. Alara watched it go, a mix of awe and gratitude swelling in her chest. She knew no one would believe her if she ever told this story. But that didn't matter. She placed a protective hand over her belly and whispered, "We are alive." The storm descended like an invisible beast, howling through the trees, carrying snow and icy winds that cut like blades. Alara clutched her belly tightly, her breath ragged as she struggled through the thick snow. She had no idea how far she had followed the bear. After the avalanche, her only instinct was to stay close to the creature that had saved her life, because if she didn't, she wouldn't survive this storm. The wind howled louder, hurling snowflakes against her face like shards of ice. Her legs were numb, her entire body trembling. Anyone in her condition, 7 months pregnant, lost in a blizzard, might have given up. But Alara refused to fall. The child inside her was still alive, and she had to find shelter before her body succumbed to the cold. Ahead, the massive grizzly bear halted, turned to look at her, its deep eyes glistening through the swirling snow. Then, it stepped into a narrow opening between the rocks. Alara staggered forward and realized there was a cave. She nearly collapsed as she entered. The space was larger than she expected, with a high ceiling and a passage stretching deep into the mountain. The wind could no longer reach her, and the snow could no longer envelop her like a suffocating shroud. Leaning against the stone wall, she struggled to catch her breath, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. The bear moved further into the cave and stopped. Slowly, Alara looked around. The dim light from the entrance revealed something unusual on the walls: ancient drawings. She leaned in, tracing her fingers over the cold, rough surface. The crude markings depicted humans and animals, not in scenes of hunting, as she had seen in other ancient cave paintings, but in gestures of connection, figures of people raising their hands toward creatures, bears, wolves, eagles, and in return, the animals lifted their limbs, responding in kind. A strange feeling washed over her. Could this be proof that humans once communicated with animals thousands of years ago? Could it be that this bear was more than just a wild creature? Her thoughts were abruptly shattered by a sharp, searing pain in her abdomen. She gasped, clutching her belly. The contraction was sudden, intense. No, it's too soon. She wasn't ready, but her body wasn't listening. Another wave of pain crashed over her, sharper than before, cutting through her like a blade. Alara sank to her knees, her breathing rapid and uneven. She couldn't do this alone. She needed Caleb. She needed a doctor. She needed someone, anyone. And then, the bear moved. It approached her cautiously, no longer a wild beast, but something else, a guardian. It lowered itself in front of her. And then, to her utter shock, it lifted one paw and made a familiar motion. Alara's breath hitched. It was a sign, one she had taught a bear years ago while working at a research center. The sign meant calm. How did it know? Another contraction ripped through her, forcing her back into reality. She groaned, sweat breaking out on her forehead despite the freezing cold. The bear continued, slowly making a series of deliberate motions with its paw and head, gestures she understood instantly. Breathe. Safe. Trust. Alara stared in disbelief. This bear didn't just understand her, it was guiding her, just as she had once guided animals before. She took a deep breath, obeying its silent instructions. Miraculously, her breathing steadied. Time blurred into a haze of pain and exhaustion. The bear remained by her side, its silent presence grounding her, its gestures keeping her focused. When the pain reached its peak, when her body gave way to something larger than herself, she clenched her jaw, her body slick with sweat, and pushed through the final agony. And then, a baby's cry pierced the silence of the cave. Alara nearly blacked out from exhaustion. But as she opened her eyes, she saw the bear sitting just feet away, watching her intently, watching the child in her arms. A girl, tiny yet strong. Her cries filled the cavern. Her tiny fists clenched against the cold. But what stunned Alara the most was the mark on the child's forehead, a faint crescent shape, as if an unseen force had left its imprint on her the moment she was born. Alara's breath trembled. She lifted her daughter closer, her heartbeat slowing as the baby's cries softened. And then, as if responding to something unseen, the child opened her eyes, a piercing blue, as deep as the winter sky. And then, the impossible happened. The newborn lifted her tiny hand and, somehow, made a sign. Alara froze. No, it couldn't be. It was a simple sign, one so basic, yet so powerful. Mother! Tears streamed down Alara's cheeks. She cradled her daughter close, feeling the fragile warmth of this tiny life, while the bear watched silent, knowing, outside, the storm still raged, but inside the cave, something beyond comprehension had taken place, a connection that defied time, bridging the past and future, the human and the wild. Alara knew, in that moment, that her life, and her daughter's, would never be the same again. As the blizzard finally subsided, an eerie silence settled over the forest. Alara was still exhausted, but she knew she couldn't remain still. Outside, the world had changed, old paths might have been buried, and if Caleb was trying to make his way back, he would find it nearly impossible. But more than anything, she needed to understand what had just happened. She needed to know why she was here, why this bear had protected her, and why her daughter, the tiny infant now sleeping peacefully in her arms, had been able to make a sign the moment she was born. The bear was still there, silent yet ever present. It watched her with deep, knowing eyes, as if waiting for something. Alara took a deep breath, her legs still trembling, but she forced herself to stand. The dim light from the cave's entrance cast faint shadows on the rock walls, illuminating the ancient paintings once more. This time, she stepped closer not just to observe, but to understand. The drawings depicted humans and animals communicating in ways she had never thought possible. Her fingers traced the crude images, a woman holding a child, a bear standing beside her, signs being exchanged between them. But what truly stunned her was the final image, a child with a crescent mark on its forehead, standing between two worlds, the human and the wild. Her heart pounded. No, couldn't be. That child, it was her daughter. Before she could process what it meant, the bear moved. It raised a massive paw and scratched lightly at the ground near a shadowed corner of the cave. A thin layer of dust lifted into the air, revealing something buried beneath. Alara frowned and slowly knelt, brushing away the dirt and debris. A wooden box. Its surface was worn by time, but it remained intact. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid. Inside, carefully wrapped in tattered cloth, was an old journal. The leather binding was cracked, the pages yellowed with age. But when she opened it, the ink was still legible, and as her eyes fell on the name inscribed on the first page, her breath caught in her throat. Astrid Thompson, her family name, an ancestor. A cold realization settled over her. She flipped through the opening pages, scanning the fading handwriting. I thought I would die in the storm, but it came to me, just as it came to those before me. A great gray bear, not a wild beast, but a guardian. It helped me bring my child into the world. And I witnessed something I never thought possible. The child understood it. My child signed. Alara gripped the journal tighter. She turned page after page, uncovering truths she had never known about her own bloodline. Astrid had lived here, in this very place, centuries ago, and she, too, had experienced what Alara had just gone through. A birth in the wilderness, aided by a creature that was more than just an animal. The cave paintings weren't myths, they were history, and Astrid wasn't the only one. As Alara read on, she realized this had happened before, over generations. a lineage of women, each born with an extraordinary connection to the natural world. Their children, marked by fate, served as a bridge between humans and animals, a legacy that had been carefully guarded in secrecy for centuries. But not everyone had accepted this truth. "They fear us," Astrid had written. "They do not understand that we are not a threat. But the world is not ready, and so, we must hide. We must protect our children, until the time is right." A shiver ran down Alara's spine. She looked down at her daughter, sleeping soundly in her arms, then back at the bear, who was still watching her, waiting. It knew. It had known all along, and now, it was waiting for her to understand. Alara hesitated, then reached out and gently ran her fingers over her daughter's forehead, over the faint crescent-shaped mark. It was no ordinary birthmark. It was a sign, a symbol of this lineage, of this destiny. The bear stepped forward, lifting a paw once more. This time, it made a single, deliberate sign, one Alara recognized instantly. "Protect." She swallowed hard, clutching the journal to her chest. Astrid had been right. The world was not ready for this truth. If anyone discovered what her daughter could do, they would fear her. They would try to control her, study her, or worse. She had to protect her child. For the first time, Alara looked at the bear and felt something deeper than gratitude. A connection, an understanding. This was no ordinary animal. It was a guardian. And now, so was she. Taking a deep breath, she rose to her feet. Outside, dawn was beginning to break, the first golden rays piercing through the snow-covered landscape. The storm was over, but the true battle had only just begun. She needed to find a way out. She needed to find Caleb. But more than anything, she needed to prepare. Because the small child in her arms was not just any child. She was the bridge between two worlds, and Alara would do whatever it took to protect her, until the world was ready for the truth. Time passed like a cold wind sweeping over the mountain peaks. 12 years had passed since that fateful night in the cave, when Alara Thompson gave birth to her daughter in the wild, with a gray bear standing guard beside her. Now, she was no longer a lost woman caught in a snowstorm. She had become one of the world's leading researchers in animal communication, a career that had taken her to the farthest corners of the planet. But what truly preoccupied her wasn't her scientific achievements or her public lectures. It was her daughter, Leora. From an early age, Leora had shown extraordinary abilities. She didn't just love animals. She understood them. At 3 years old, she could sit beside a deer for hours without frightening it. At 5, birds circled around her in a rhythmic dance, as if following a melody only she could hear. And by the time she turned 10, she could lock eyes with a wild wolf and, with a single glance, make it retreat without aggression. But what shocked Alara the most was the first time Leora realized her own mark. One summer morning, as golden sunlight streamed through the window of Alara's research study, Leora walked in, gripping an old book she had found in her mother's library. "Mom," she whispered, rolling up her sleeve to reveal a faint, crescent-shaped mark on her arm, the same mark that had appeared on her forehead at birth. Alara froze. She had tried to protect Leora from the truth, tried to keep her safe, but the truth could not stay hidden forever. "I have it too," Leora said, her voice filled with quiet certainty. "And I'm not the only one." Alara frowned. "What do you mean?" Leora flipped open the book, pointing to a passage written by an 18th century scholar, a record of children across the world, marked by mysterious signs on their bodies, possessing an unusual ability to communicate with animals. But the most unsettling part? These children had disappeared without a trace. A chill ran down Alara's spine. A truth begins to unfold. Days later, at an international conference on animal communication in Geneva, the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. After delivering a speech on the potential for interspecies communication through nonverbal cues, Alara was approached by several scientists. Dr. Thompson, an older Japanese researcher, said cautiously, "You are not the only one with a child like this." Alara's breath caught. In a secluded meeting room at the conference, a small group of researchers gathered, each carrying a similar story. Their children, too, possessed an unexplainable connection with animals. A woman from Brazil spoke of her 7-year-old son, who could guide dolphins through hand gestures alone. A scientist from India told of his niece, who could stop an entire herd of elephants in their tracks with a simple motion of her fingers. But the most disturbing revelation was what was happening across the world. Something is changing, a Russian researcher said, his voice low. Animals are behaving strangely, flocks of birds migrating at the wrong times, wolves appearing in places they've never been before. And then, the disasters. An archaeologist placed a stack of photographs on the table. Ancient caves from North America, Africa, Asia, all containing nearly identical prehistoric drawings. But what stunned them the most? In recent months, some of the cave walls had begun to glow, revealing an unknown language, never seen before. Alara's pulse quickened. This wasn't just an isolated phenomenon. This was global. Something was waking up, and she knew she could no longer turn away from it. The journey for answers, together with a team of scientists and individuals bearing the mark. Alara embarked on an expedition to uncover the truth. From one continent to another, they traced ancient symbols, deciphering what they called the ancient sign system, a forgotten language that once connected humans and animals thousands of years ago. A language that, long ago, all humans might have understood, but over time, had been lost. But not everyone wanted this knowledge to resurface. As their research progressed, Alara realized they were being watched by secret organizations, powerful figures who sought to control these children, to use their abilities for their own agendas. Anyone who knew too much was silenced. Alara understood then, this wasn't just a scientific mystery. This was a battle for the future of humanity. The encounter. One night, in a remote archaeological site in Turkey, Alara sat in her research tent, poring over ancient manuscripts by lamplight. The air outside was still, unnervingly quiet. Then, a shadow moved outside her tent. She grabbed a small knife instinctively. Her body tensed. The canvas flapped. And for a moment, she expected to see an intruder, one of the forces trying to stop her. But when the flap lifted, she froze in shock. A boy stood before her, no older than 13. His sharp eyes gleamed like those of a hawk, and on his forehead, under the pale glow of the moon, was a crescent-shaped mark. He said nothing, but as Alara hesitantly raised her hand, forming a familiar sign, a sign that the gray bear had once taught her long ago, the boy lifted his own hand, responding with a sign she had never seen before. Yet somehow, she understood it instantly. We are ready. Alara took a slow, steady breath. The real journey was just beginning. 20 years had passed since that fateful day in the cave, when Leora was born in the heart of the wild, cradled in the protective presence of a mysterious gray bear. She was no longer a child marked by destiny. She was now one of the most influential leaders of the movement known as the Marked Children, a movement that had forever changed humanity's understanding of the natural world. The world was no longer the same. For 2 decades, science had been forced to confront an undeniable truth. Animals were trying to communicate with humans. No longer just vague theories or scattered reports. Now, irrefutable evidence was appearing across every major media platform. From the depths of the oceans, marine biologists detected signals from whales that were no longer just random songs. They had structure, patterns, and even repetition, akin to a language. In the African jungles, elephants had begun emitting ultrasonic sounds, forming rhythmic patterns that bore similarities to ancient human languages. In the Arctic, wolves moved in formations never seen before, as if they were performing a coordinated visual language. Migratory birds abandoned their usual routes, not following the seasons, but something greater, an invisible map that no scientist could explain. And then came the caves. From South America to Siberia, from the Himalayas to the isolated islands of the Pacific. A series of ancient caves, once home to prehistoric paintings, had begun to glow, not with artificial light, but with an energy never seen before, ancient symbols illuminating as if they had just been carved by the hand of the earth itself. Scientists had no explanation, but Leora knew, because she had been waiting for this moment her entire life. The global summit, the awakening of the planet. In Geneva, within the largest hall of the United Nations, a historic summit was taking place, witnessed by millions around the world. Governments, scientists, and world leaders had gathered. But most importantly, those who had carried the mark for decades, the children, now grown, who had changed everything. Leora stepped onto the stage. She was no longer the quiet child standing behind her mother, silently observing. She was the one leading humanity to the truth. We have always believed that we are the only species on Earth with consciousness, she said, her voice resonating across the hall. We have convinced ourselves that animals are nothing more than wild creatures, driven purely by instinct, without language, without thought, without understanding. But that has never been true. She raised her hand, and behind her, a massive screen came to life. Across the world, images appeared, the marked children, now young adults, standing among wild animals, using hand signs and gestures, and immediately, the animals responded. In Kenya, a young boy signed to an elephant, and it knelt before him. In Japan, a girl lifted her hand toward a pod of humpback whales, and they halted mid-movement, forming a perfect circle, as if listening. In Brazil, a young man stood before a pack of wolves, and in unison, they tilted their heads to the sky and howled in a precise, measured rhythm. The entire room held its breath. This is not theory. This is not an illusion, Leora continued. This is language, an ancient language that humanity once understood. But then, we forgot. And now, it is returning. The hall was frozen in silence. Some scientists whispered urgently to one another. Some politicians shook their heads. But no one could deny what they had just witnessed. And it is not just language. Leora's gaze swept across the room. It is a call from the earth itself. At that very moment, a deep, resonant sound echoed across the world. No one knew where it came from, but every satellite, every seismic detector, registered it. A tremor from deep within the earth, as if the planet itself had awakened. Then, the screen changed. The images of the glowing caves appeared, and in every location, the symbols on the walls began to shift. No longer mere drawings, they were forming a message that, when translated by the brightest minds on Earth, revealed one singular phrase: we were once one, and we can be one again. The room fell into absolute silence. And then, something even more extraordinary happened. The great doors of the hall swung open. Every gaze turned toward the entrance, and there, a massive gray bear stepped forward. It was old. Its fur was tinged with silver. Its body bore the scars of time, but its eyes remained sharp, as piercing as ever. It walked slowly, deliberately, through the hall, and as it did, the people stepped aside not out of fear, but out of something greater, recognition. When it reached Leora, it stopped. She knelt, looking into its deep, knowing eyes. A long, heavy silence filled the air. Then, the bear lifted its paw, and it made a sign, a single sign, simple, powerful. Together, Leora closed her eyes. Tears spilled down her cheeks. She understood. The world had reached a turning point. Humanity could either accept that they were not the only conscious beings on this planet, or reject the truth, and continue down the path of destruction and isolation. But Leora knew this time they had no choice, because Earth had spoken, and it was waiting for an answer. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please comment 1. And if you didn't, just hit like. See you in the next videos.